Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we're heading into one of the oldest chapters of human storytelling, the strange and fascinating tale of the Anunnaki. If you've never heard of them, the Anunnaki were a group of gods first mentioned in the cuneiform tablets of Mesopotamia more than 4,000 years ago. They appear in creation myths, epic pottery, and royal inscriptions. And in many ways, they were the backbone of Sumerian and Akkadian religion. What makes the Anunnaki a special interest is how they have been reinterpreted again and again. The Babylonians made them the companions of gods, like Marduk and Ishtar. Later, Assyrian texts gave them other duties, and in recent decades, they've been adopted into modern theories about lost civilizations and even visitors from Thest. From clay tablets to conspiracy books, the Anunnaki have traveled an extraordinary distance. As always, I'd love to know where in Thewald are you listening from, and what time is it for you? Whether you're settling down for sleep or just curious about how myths can travel through time, I'm glad you're here. Now, let's begin. If you want to picture the beginning of cities, do not start with marble columns or tidy avenues. Imagine a wide flat plain at the lower end of the Tigris and Euphrates, a land of glistening mud and dressless water that today lies mostly in southern Iraq. Each spring, the river swelled split into shifting channels and left behind silt that could grow grain in improbable abundance. Their floods were unpredictable. One year they failed, another year they ruined fields. To survive, people learned to coax water through ditches and embankments. Out of that practical struggle with mud and time came something new in villages that had once been little clusters of reed huts became towns with canals, storehouses, shrines, and busy quays. A few of those towns become true cities. We call that place Sumer. Archaeologists give names to the eras of Sumer, as if they were chapters in a patient book. The Ubaid period, Brauti temples, painted pottery, and the first organized irrigation. The Euro period followed, beginning roughly in 4th millennium before the Common Era, and with it the first city that we can actually picture in detail. Yorgrunto, a metropolis by ancient standards, perhaps home to tens of thousands of people, which is astonishing when you think that a few centuries earlier, their ancestors still hunted wild pig and collected reeds on the marsh edge. Uruk had districts, monumental fatas, and temple compounds. It had workshops for potters, metal workers, and weavers. It had administrators with a talent for counting other people's grain. Uruk's skyline, if you can call it that, rose in tiers of brick. There was Azakad precinct, dedicated to an mistress of love, war, and civic pride, and another to An, the sky god, whose enum would echo through the centuries. On one high platform stood a whitewashed temple that caught the sun for miles. Sacros, the plain citizens, climbed processional stairways with offerings of barley, beer, and dates. Priests tended fires and wrote on wet clay. The city sounded like 1,000 small industries running atoms. Kilns roared. Millstones rasped, goats bleated in lanes shaded by at the quays, barges from upriver unloaded timber and stone. That fluvial plain could not provide for itself. This is where writing begins to look like writing. For generations, people had marked tallies on clay tokens shaped like cones and spheres. Then, in Uruk, officials pressed signs into clay tablets with sharpened reeds. At first, these were simple records, ofrations, and deliveries. Then came signs for names, places, and actions. Those wedge marks are what we now call cuneiform. It started as a ledger and evolved into literature, lore, and myth. In the space of a few centuries, scribes went from listing sheep to recording hymns and royal deeds. One day, someone drew the first map on clay and made a small miracle that no one noticed at the time. The Sumerians organized their world around the city temple. The temple owned fields, canals, herds, and workshops. It rationed beer to workers and held thekis to the granary. To move water and marshal labor, people needed hierarchy. Titles emerged. An ensi was a city governor, a steward of the god. A lugalas, a king, literally a big man, wasted for the city in war and treaty. He was not a god, but he could speak to the gods on behalf of the people. Councils met in courtyards and decided everything from canal clearing to boundary dispute. When you read the tablets, you can hear the civic rhythm. Send so many men to dredge this reach of the canal, deliver so many baskets of barley to Thetemple brewery. Repair the quay before the date harvest. Other cities rose along the rivers. Nepa became the spiritual hub where Thegrit gods convened and where kings sought divine approval for their rule. Eridu, far to the south on the old Gulf shore, boasted a sacred lineage that Sumerians called the oldest in Thel. Flourished near the river mouth and walled. Later built a ziggurat, so grand that it would still impress travelers. 2,000 years on, Lagash grew powerful and wrote about land surveys and legal reforms under a ruler named Urakoginaho. In a burst of civic grit, tried to protect widows and curb the graft officials. Kish watched the northern approaches and appears again and again in early royal lists, which suggests Ithad the swagger of a gatekeeper. Sumer had few trees, little stone and knockapore in the ground, yet its people wanted all three, so they traded. Boats slipped down canals into the river and out to the Gulf. Then on to Dilmun, which Moscola's place in Bahrain and the eastern Arabian coast. There they acquired copper from the land they called Magain, probably Oman, and shipped it home as ingots. They coveted lapis lazuli, a blue stone that came from far beyond Alilam and the Zagros. Likely from Afghanistan through long chains of exchange, cedar came from the mountains of Dalavant and the Taurus. In return, Sumer sent out woolen textiles, processed foods, and crafted goods. A potter in Europe could turn clay into trade goods stat, paid for copper tools used to dye the canals that watered the fields that fed the potter. It was the first compounding of an economy on record. Agriculture drove everything. The soil was generous but tricky. Without careful watering, it dried into a tough crust. With too much watering and poor drainage, it accumulated salt that stunted barley. The Sumerians' Laneto rotate crops, flush fields, and cut new channels when old ones clogged. They measured time for work in the sexes Melistum, a base 60 way of counting that still gives us 60 minutes in the hour and 360 in a circle. They assembled lists of professions and plants in tablet. There were words for different types of canal, different grades of beer, different kinds of reeds for mats and ropes. It is the vocabulary of Apopel who learned that survival depends in knowing how to name what you use. Religion was not set apart from this daily grind. It saturated it. Each city placed a patron deity at the center of its identity. Inanna stood for Uruk Enki. The clever lord of waters presided at Eridu Nana. The moon god watched over in. The force of air and authority had his great temple at Nep, where kings came to receive the token of rule. People did not visit shrines out of habit alone. They believed the gods feed in offerings, guided omens, and decided which projects would thrive. Festivals brought whole populations into thestries to sing, carry statues, and marked turning of seasons. When a canal held, when a harvest exceeded, when a caravan returned intact, the credit went first to the gods. In these early centuries, we see the first outlines of the divine family that Sumerians is called the princely seed, the offspring of the sky. The specific rosters would vary from city to city and from century to century, but the idea was simple. The world is not random. It is organized, a council of powerful beings who assign roles to gods and tasks to whom. That council is what later texts will call the Anunnaki. At this stage, the name functions as a label for the high gods of the pantheon more than a fixed list. What matters is the sense of the temple administrators, divid fields, and water rights. The Divine Assembly imagined on a grander, planet-devoted realms and destinies. Sumerian art captures this order with charming directness. Cylinder seals carved in fine detail show processions of worshippers, banquets, musicians, ploughmen, and officials receiving a rodent ring from a seated deity. Relief show horned crowns and flowing beards that mark divine status. The gods look like majestic versions of humans because the people who made them were trying to think with familiar forms. A god of Thesan holds a sawtooth symbol of justice because sunlight reveals what is hidden. A god of the river pours water from a jar, because that is what rivers look like in a world made of clay and canals. Law and memory grew out of this complex. The earliest surviving law codes from later in the tradition would appear it and elsewhere, but their spirit already shows in the administrative adels of the Uruk and early dynasty. Contracts record loans were paid in barley, oaths invoked deities, togorante honest weights. Land transfer scribe precise field edges, with reference to canals and boundary stones. You can feel a society learning to trust written word as much as the spoken known, which is a quiet revolution of its own. War was an unwanted but recurring part of the story. Cities quarreled over water and territory. Armies marched along canal banks. Troops pulled battle wagons with solid wooden wheels. Fortified walls rose around cities and sent their brick weight into theorizing. Victory stelas recorded outcomes with blunt clarity. In one famous fragment from later centuries, a king of Lagash boasts of reclaiming a border ditch and erecting a stone that lists field distances with a surveyor's care. The concerns are mundane, and yet who controls the head of a Connell controls the life of thousands. What then made Sumer the cradle of civilization in more than name? City sand writing, yes, but also the idea, Thathaman effort and divine favor, together called make a precarious land livable. The Sumerians took a marshy delta and turned it into a network of fields and towns that fed artisans and scribes, priests and merchants. They learned totten grain into beer and surplus into. They built into brick the belief that the universe has an order and Thatchites can mirror it if they organize them spees well. Out of this matrix, thestries of the gods took on particular shapes. People looked up from their lieges and their canals and asked who's it the rules of the world in the first place. The Sumerians began their story at Thuidus possible scale. Before people dug the first canal, before a scribe pressed a sign into wet clay, there was a single mass of sky and earth. They called Deskian, they called the earth key. Imagine an unbroken whole that needed to be parted so that space could open for life. That division is the first act in their cosmic history. From An and Ki came a family of gods. Their name for this clan was the Anunnaki, which means the princely cedar, the offspring of An. In other words, these were not distant spirits. They were a royal household born from union of sky and earth. The Sumerians pictured them as a council. They met, argued, and reached decisions that set the pattern of the world. When a king took the throne, when a river changed course, when a city flourished, it was because the great gods had decreed it. At the center stood Enlil. He was Thephos of air and authority. Sumerian poems say that he separated heaven. He took the earth for his own realm, while his father An kept Theski. This was not a violent battle. In the way later myths would imagine it was an act that created. From that moment, the world had led. The high dome where the middle ground where Enlil rules over fields, cities, wind, and storm. The deep waters beneath which belong to a different power entirely. That power is Enki in Adian texts. Hayes called Ea. He is lord of fresh water, wisdom, and craft. His home is Eridu Asati. The Sumerians is claimed as the oldest seat of worship. They imagine it as temple, standing near the edge of marsh, and see where sweet water and salt water meet. Enki appears again and again as the god who solves problems. Heshebe's plans, assigns functions, and looks for clever ways to keep the system running when others have made a mess of it. Ninharag belongs with them at the start. She is the great lady of the Sakrab mountain, a mother figure who presides over birth, growth, and the vitality of the land. In some traditions, she is the very key of the first generation seen under a personal name. In others, she is Adistic mother goddess who works with Enki when life needs a maker. When Sumerians speak of shaping humankind from clay, they often place Ninhosag athside of the creator. Steady and capable around these leading figures stand other children of the sky. Nana, also Khalidsin in Adian, is the moon god whose shining bark crosses the night. His Greek temple rose at and its priest timed the months by his waxing and waning light. Utu, called Shamash Lateron, is the sun and the judge who Cecil. His cult center at Sippar and Lhasa connected justice with daily light. Inanna, called Ishtar, in later texts embodies love, passion, and the sharp edges of war. Her temple district at Turuk was famous for wealth, song, and pageant. Each of these deities belongs to the high family. Each carries a domain that mirrors something essential in daily Sumerian life. If you look at how the stories work, you see a careful design. The divine family is both a map of nature and a model of government and sits above as a figurehead. Her rarely acts. Enlil governs the middle world with force and decree. Enki advises and invents, easing conflicts with wit and craft. Nin, hers gives form and endurance. The younger gods execute tasks that match their natures. You two bring justice because sunlight reveals, and Nana marks time because the moon is a clock you can trust with your eyes. Inanna animates human bonds and human violence because both belong to the heat of life. The pantheon is not a list. It is a working chart. The word Anunnaki does not fix a single rest. In one composition, you may see Sven named as the most senior. In another, you meet a wider assembly Caled be the same title. What remains steady is the idea that these are the great gods, the high court that assign. When a text says the Anunnakasat, It means that the great powers gathered and reached a binding decision. The Sumerian says imagined this council at Enlil's holy city, where kings came to seek tokens of legitimate rule. In ritual terms, a ruler became real when the cosmic bureaucracy said yes. Art supports this picture. The horned crown marks a god. The rod and ring in Adavine hand mark the gift of measured authority. Cylinder seals show theseated deity conferring signs of rule owner, human official who approaches with a clean hand and gaze averted. In thesis scenes, you can see the same social grammar that runs through temple counts and boundary stones. The cosmos is orderly, rank matters, powers are delegated. Duties are assigned to fit the task and the season. Poems and hymns often list the me, atom that we can translate as the divine ordinances of culture and nature. They are the attributes and functions that make civilization run. Temple building, kingship, music, weaving, truth, victory, and even paradoxical things like strife are counted among the me. In Oni's famous story, Enki gathers the me in his shrine at Eridu. Inanna travels there and, in a lively exchange, obtains a seat off them and carries them back to Uruk. The tale is playful, but the message is serious. Civilized life depends on a structured package of powers that Thegods control and can distribute. This cosmic order also needs a place for the Sumerians considered Phaeto be a fixed thread once it was spoken be the council. Enlil is often Kaledthi, one who decrees destinies. In other texts, the whole assembly of the Anunnaki is said to have spoken the outcomes of ages and kings. That is how a mythic universe meant, not through constant miracles, but through a shared understanding among the highest. Binds about how things are supposed to go. Geography anchors the theology. Neparis's seat of Enlil and the stage for high decision. Eridu holds Enki's sweet waters and becomes the source of crafts and wisdom. Keeps the time of the moon and turns that time into calendars, and Uruk celebrates Inanna, Auntie's beauty and might to civic life. Saifar and Lhasa shine for Utu and Linkson light to law. When you map the Sepites, you are mapping the body of the pantheon across the plain. One striking detail is how human Thegods can seem without losing grandeur. They eat offerings. They wear robes annually. They ride in processions. They take offense and reconcile. They act like a royal house whose moods matter to everyone who lives down the street. This is not because Sumerians could not imagine abstraction. It is because they wanted a world that could be addressed. A farmer with a problem needs a god who can't listen and act. A king who needs a sign looks for a council that can vote. If you wanted to meet the Anunnaki on a workday, you would begin at Nippur. Not city as archaeologists dig it today, but the living place that once lay at the bend of a canal. Picture broad courts paved with beaten clay, doorways set with cedar beams, and a great race where the temple of Enlil Tidats, brick shoulders above the plain. Priests strode through the courts with freed bundles in their arms, scribes breast tablets on their thighs, and messengers carried small, sealed jars that held oil for lamps and offerings. To a Sumerian, Nepa was more than a city. It was the meeting point of earth and the unseen. It was where the great gods gathered to decide how the year would go. The Anunnaki operated like a council. They did not rule by accident or whim. They sat in assembly and issued decrees. The word that appears in so many texts, destiny. Once spoken by the council, a destiny was fixed. A king who held his throne with ease was a man who had been approved in that court. A king who struggled had missed a vote he needed. If a river cut a new channel and spared a district from flood, people said the Anunnaki had decided it would be so when trouble arrived. The complaint went upward by prayer and offering in the hope that the council would reconsider Sumerians' loved lists, and this taste for order shows up in their theology. Poets speak of the me, the Devon ordinances that make civilization. These are the building blocks of culture. Music belongs on the list. So do weaving, bricklaying, fair judgment, and kingship. The Anunnaki hold these powers. They can bestow them, withdraw them, or pass them from one necessity to another. In the myth Thatchelers call Enki in the world order, Enki tours the lands and Osines verse it to different gods. Grain and cattle received their keepers. Rivers receive their guardians. Marshes, mountains, and sea coasts are given to deities who suit them. It is a tiddy picture because the Sumerians believed that a tidy cosmos was a livable one. When a new ruler took office, he did not merely seize a chair. He came to Nepa for recognition. The ritual language says that Enlil fixed the king's fate. In practice, that meant the priest who'd acted him. Processions were held and dots were sworn in the names of the Greek gods. Seals from this world show a seated deity handing a rod and ring to a human figure. The scene is not random art. It is an explanation in miniature. Authority is a measured thing. It comes from the divine court and is given to Asati through its chosen leader. The Anunnaki were imagined as very-present beings. Artists carved them with horned crowns that signaled divinity, long beards, and robes with patternedums. A few images hint at an aura Thatchelers call Melam, a radiant presencer that made hair stand and knees soften, yet they were human enough to hold a banquet, to take advice, and to frown at poor manners. This mix of grandeur and familiarity made them approachable in A farmer could pour beer at a small shrine because he believed Thegrit ones listened even when busy with weighty matters. People did not worship the Anunnaki as a single unit. There was no temple of the Anunnaki with a combined staff and a single cult statue. Devotion focused on individual gods. Enlil at Nepa, Inanot Uruk Enki at Eridu, Nana at Utu, at Sipa and Lhasa. Each city served its patron with festivals, food offerings, and music. Yet the group name mattered. In oaths, scribes sometimes invoked Anunnaki to witness a boundary or a treaty. It was a way of calling Thuho, court, as notaries. If you breaketh oath, you did not merely offend one god, you insulted the senior board. Divination grew out of this belief that decisions were made above. If Theckensil set the line of events, people wanted a way to read that line before it reached them. Mesopotamians developed aircraft for this. Priests poured oil on water and studied the shapes made by Thephlum. They watched the stars and drew up long lists that connected signs in Deski with events on Earth. They steered livers of sacrificial sheep and read marks on the surface like a message. These were not party tricks. They were a serious effort to ask, has the court already spoken? And if so, what did it say? The Omen series that later Scholar Skull, Enuma Anu, Enlil shows how systematic this could become. A red glow around the moon meant one thing for the a wind from a given quarter during an eclipse meant something else for a campaign. Scribes recorded all this activity with a care that feels modern. A tablet might read that on a certain day of a certain month, a priest observed a sign, and that sign matched a known entry in unnamed list. Another tablet might note that a king vowed a gift to Enlil if he returned safely from a march, and that Hefel filled the vow on the third day after his return. Foundation deposits buried Ender. New walls included small objects and written prayers. 2. The gods, asking them to protect the building, and Tophava, the city that built it. The habitus, both practical and devout. It is insurance in the oldest sense. You do your work, and then you ask the highest court to co-sign it. The council also set the pace of Theritrial year. Each city had its own calendar, but the logic was shared. New moons marked beginnings. Planting and harvest brought processions into Thestrits. Lamentations were sung in Lintines. Joyful hymns were sung when canals filled and fields turned green. In later Babylon, the New Year would become a grand civic rite in which a king took the hand of a god and walked through the city. But the roots of that idea lay in Sumer, where public life and divine favor moved in step. It is tempting to imagine that such a chord would be calm and above quarrel. The stories suggest otherwise. The Anunnaki agreed on the structure of things. They did not always agree on things. Hymns praise Enlil as a stern ruler who keeps order, but also note that his judgments can be severe. Inca gains a reputation for finding a humaner path when rigid decrees prove harmful. Anna pushes boundaries and forces newcomes when old customs block change. This is not squabbling for its own sake. It is a way to explore how a society balances needs. Order holds, but mercy matters. Energy breaks. Stalemate. 2 features of this world help explain the council always mattered. First, Mesopotamia was unstable by nature. Rivers shifted. Drought years came. Neighboring cities eyed each other's fields. A shared belief that distinguished where set above gave emotional ballast. Second, the economy was collective at its core. Irrigation required a workforce moving in step. If the lordship could present decisions as confirmed by the Anunnaki, people were more likely to accept hard assignments. When the canal roster came out, Aframan could show the tablet and say that the gods approve this schedule. Grumble if you must, but bring your... There was also a darker edge to the faith. If destinies were fixed, failure could be read as a sign that a fate had turned. A city that fell might compose aliment that said its patron god had left the temple. Priests would carry Thestritu away in ritual and sing for its These poems are moving to Devon now. They speak of gates broken, fires in the courtyards, and empty streets where singers once walked. Thecure for such grief was always the same. Rebuild the walls, re-roof the halls. Make offerings, invite the council to bless the work, wait for the verdict to change. By the time we reach the later part of the second millennium, the idea of a formal object called the Tablet of Destinies appears in myth. In one story, a proud being steals it from the house of Enlil, and chaos follows until Theta Blay is recovered. The tale enlarges a simple idea. If you remove the authority that fixes outcomes, the world shakes. Return the authority to its place. Andada resumes. The picture that emerges is clear. The Anunnaki are not flashes of storm and fire. They are the architecture behind events. Their court gives shape to Ea, a rain, a harvest, and a war. Their signs are written in the sky and in the liver of a sheep. In their successful launch of a barge, and in the safe return of a caravan. Their images wear horns, because rank should be obvious. Their gifts are measured back as power without measure is not power at all. And all of this was as real to a Sumerian as the feel of wet clay and the sound of a millstone. The Sumerians did not leave their god sitting on high thrones without errands. They set them to work, and then they told stories about how that work was done. If you walk the shelves of their tablets, you find a busy calendar of divine tasks. That explains why the world looks the way it does. The point was never to dazzle. The point was to make sense. Afrovers, fields, kingship, justice, and the sometimes baffling turns of fortune. A good place to begin is a composition show's call Enki and the World Order. It reads like a tour and a briefing combined. Enki sets out from his home at Eridu and assigns responsibilities as Hegos. He gives the marshes their keeper sand, their reeds. He appoints guardians for the Tigris and the Euphrates. Henam's deities who will mind grain, cattle, carpentry, metalwork, and weaving. Mountains get their overseers, sea coasts receive theirs. The story Ivory, Sumerian in spirit. It treats the almost as an irrigation system that needs competent foremen. Enki acts like a chief engineer with a talent for matching roles to talents. If you group in a land with a wrong canal gauche could ruin a year, you would find this comforting. The idea that culture itself is a set of words entrusted to cities appears again the tale of the me. These are Thetivini ordinances that make civilized life possible. They include music, writing, kingship, truth, skill trades, and the practical and awkward things that life requires, even rivalry and conflict. In one lively episode, Inanna goes to Enki at Eridu and persuades him to pour the me into a boat. She sails for Uruk with the cargo while Enki wakes, realizes what happened, and sends creatures to stop her. They fail. Inanna arrives at Uruk with the gifts, and the city blooms with new arts and institutions. It is an origin story that avoids thunder in favor of logistics. A goddess brings home the toolkit of culture. Her people get to work. Kingship itself needed a mythic stamp of approval. The Sumerian king list is a sober little text that provides it. It claims that kingship descended from heaven. It then marches through a sequence of cities and rulers to show how that gift moved over time. Before the flood, it rests in Eridu, then Babira, then Larak, then Sippar, then Shrupak. After the flood, it reappears at Kish. The list is not accurate history by modern standards, but it shows how people understood political change when a city rose. It was because a thousand council of the great gods had handed it the office. When a city fell, the office moved on. The Anunnaki do not appear in person in the king list, yet their hand is everywhere in its logic. Order comes from above. Authority is borrowed, never owned in long narrative poetry. The Anunnaki appear at the edges of crucial scene sand. Their presence carries weight. The best known example lies inside the Epic of Gilgamesh. There, an old Saviva tells of a flood that drowned the world. It was not a random storm. It was Adasitzen. The great gods had agreed, Tausland's humankind, whose noise had ground, and the flood comes. The chosen man survives by building a boat on a warning from a friendly god. When the waters sink, he offers a sacrifice. Thetic says that the gods gather like flies around the smoke because they have gone hungry without human offerings. Thaline is vivid and slightly sardonic, and it tells you how. Sumerians thought a booth bond between heaven and earth. People feed the gods with festivals, and the gods keep the world in working order, break the arrangement, and both sides suffer. Justice also has a divine procedure. Utu, whom Adian speakers call Shamash, is the sun and the judge. He hears petitions and travels the sky to see what people do when they think no one is looking. In art, he carries a saw-toothed symbol and steps through horizon gates at morning as if stepping into a court. When an oath is sworn on a canal bank or in a temple court, Utu and the Anunnaki are coleto witness it. That is more than a flourish. It is a way to say that Apramise binds in multiple realms. Thuritan tablet records it in clay. Thedavine court records it in a place bay in tampering. From time to time, a story shows us the Anunnaki in a strictly judicial pose. The most striking is the descent of the goddess decides to visit their realm of the dead ruled by her sister. She passes 7 gates and 8 Chake gates leaves a piece of her regalia at the deepest point. She is judged by 7 Anunnaki of the underworld. They do not argue. They pronounce, Inanna is tracked down and hung on a hook. Only a cleaver rescue arranged by other gods brings her back. The message is stark. There are rules below as well as above and the old high gods serve as judges in both places. That some texts use the name Anunnaki for chthonic judges, while others use it for the celestial council, tells you less about contradiction than about range. The same ancient power servicey fate in every layer. Temple building is another duty rapid in story. Gda of Lagash left us long inscriptions about the instructions he received in a dream to rebuild the house of Ningasu. He describes precise measurements, materials, and rites. He speaks Aftavine approval for every step, from choosing clay to setting door leaves. Heckles on the great gods to bless the work and to dwell within it. Read alongside foundation deposits from a third. You see a pattern. A ruler presents a bricks and mortar project. Asa responds to a request from above. The Anunnaki are the ultimate planning board. When they approve, walls rise and last. There are quieter texts where the gods teach by proverb. The instructions of Shurupak sets out advice that a father gives a son. Do not move, abandon. Do not neglect the canal bank. Do not mistreat the wife of a soldier. Trust a reliable boatman. These are no thunderbolts, yet they come wrapped in the authority of the earliest age when wise kings had the will of the gods. The effect is to weave divine duty into daily. The Anunnaki do not appear Asheractors, but their expectations Shapeti advice. Boundaries matter because of gods hate disorder. Canal banks matter because a breach threatens the common good. The idea that the gods assign tasks, al-suk shapes, military tales. Inmakar and the Lord of Arata is a perif, long poems about a ruler of Uruk, who seeks fine stone and metals from a far land. In the mountains, he invokes Inannas, his patron. He sends a herald with demons and boasts. He proposes riddle-sand spells. At several points, the gods dip the balance in his favor, not with lightning, but with the gift of. One version claims that Ansathir was a time when all people spoke Eon tongue, and that the god of wisdom changed it. The poems sit at the edge of myth and memory, but the theme stays familiar. The success of a city depends on whether its patron can persuade the council to grant it what it needs. Of offerings, add detail. Tothi's grand themes, we have lists from Uruk and other cities that tally what was given to which Godin, which day. Barley, beer, bread, dates, oxen, sheep, birds, fish, perfumes. The quantities are large and often specific. Behind the numbers lies a simple premise. An orderly world asks sets people to keep up their side of Thebagin. If you want the Anunnaki to keep decreeing harvests, victories, and safe returns, you keep their kitchen sand, their music staffed. When trouble comes, you do not accuse. You add offerings, sing laments, and ask their court to reconsider. Divination manuals complete the picture of divine duty with a frankness that is most scientific. Clay models of sheep livers carry labels for zones and marks. Each feature has an interpretation grand in long observation and aimery of outcomes. Celestial omens are logged the same way. When Mars appears near a certain starand, a wind blows from a certain quarter. Scribes note what happened the last time and the time before that. This is not magic used as spectacle. It is record-keeping habit applied to belief. The Anunnaki set the line of events. People try to read it honestly by the later centuries of Mesopotamian research. New epics would place younger gods at the center of creation. Story Sand, the Old Council, would be pictured as a large assembly counted by those later developments do not erase the older pattern. In Sumer, the Anunnaki are the elders who organize the world and continue to serve as thecad of record. They assign the meed they approve rulers. They bless or withdraw blessing from cities. They judge in life and judge in death. Their work is not fireworks. It is administration at the largest scale. All of this leads to the most consequential task the gods ever undertook. They needed workers for thinless chores of a living world. Their junior gods were tired of dredging canals and hauling baskets. The elders considered a remedy and chose a path that would change the story of the earth from that moment on. The story begins with work. Not our work, but the work of gods who found themselves doing the sort of chores that make shoulders ache. After the great separation of heaven and earth, Thule needed canals, fields, and boundaries. The junior gods, called Thyagi in later Adian texts, were given hard labor. They dug channels through wet clay, raised levees, and cut brick by brick the foundations after. For a long time, they endured. Some versions say 40 years. Others say longer, and the number matters less than the feeling. Time passed in the rhythm of baskets filled and carried. Songs kept pace. Shoulders burned. The revolt arrives like a gust out of a hot night. In the old Babylonian pamphlet, scholars call a tressus, the worker gods can carry no more. They march as a group to the house of Enlil at Nippur. They do not knock. They surround Thegats and throw down their tools, which is an image that would have made any Mesopotamian nod in recognition. Asterisk is a strike, whether you are a divini or human. Nusku-Enlil's vizier brings word to his master that the canal crews are in open defiance. Enlil is furious. He calls for punishment. Then the senior gods think again. Breaking your own workforce has consequences. Enki, also called Ea, offers a plan that is at once practical and deeply imaginative. He proposes the making of a new creaturetto, take up the hard tasks. This will not be a beast of burden, but a being that can understand, command, accept, ration, and keep time. A being who can stand before a shrine with steady hands. To Dothis Enki says, you must mix clay from life-bearing ground with something that carries divine purpose. The council, a single god from among their bells, will be selected not as Ascapegoat alone, but as a source of fliving essence. In different tablets, the name varies. Some call him Gishtua, which carries the sense of intelligence. Others use Ilo. The idea is a god whose mind is a store of knowledge, will provide the blood that turns clay into a creature who can learn. The scene in the workshop feels Vividevan on a broken tablet. Nenu, also known as Ninhosag, or Mummy, takes the lead as birth goddess. Enki brings clay from thawed deep waters under the land, the sweetwater domain that the Sumerians is called the Abzu. The blood of the chosen god is mixed into the clay. Rituals are spoken over bowl. 7 and 7 birth goddesses are assembled, each to shape and carry a portion. They place the forms in a kind of months pass, counted with care, because nothing in Mesopotamia escapes the calendar. When the time is right, the Wampausi opens and the first humans emerge. The text pauses here, as if someone in Thayrum took a breath and looked closely at faces of those who had just arrived. These new beings, called people without fanfare, are immediately given assignments. The purpose is clear. They will carry the baskets that they will dredge the canals. They will tend the temple fields, grind grain, brew beer, bake bread, and raise walls. They will maintain the inner order of the temple courts with brooms drawn from reed beds. In return, they will receive rations, clothing, and protection. The gods will be relieved of a burden that was never theirs to bear for long. Humans will now stand between earth and heaven as a working link. The poem does not stop with a single act of creation. It imagines a system. Humans multiply, and with growth come new problems. Rations need to be. Labor needs to be organized. The first records of human life in Feta Blaze echo the promise in the myth. We see corv rosters that send men to digonals by the week. We see lists of barley assigned talkers. We see temple inventories that measure loaves, jars, and animals for offerings. The new creature has stepped fully into the complex that Sumer had built. Clay tablets track clay bodies at work. Enki's role throughout is not that of a distant maker, but of a patron who wants design to hold. He grants knowledge in stages. He teaches the use of tools, the making of bricks, and the handling golf boats along the canal bends. He sets out instructions for how to bring sweet water into fields while letting salt wash away. In one set of lines, Hequiatly arranges that midwives will learn their craft, and that women will know how to bring children into Thruald safely. The myth cares about survival on a very practical level. Nino, as mother of mankind, is not merely a ceremonial figure. She grieves when mortality enters the story, and she rejoices when order returns after crisis. In one scene she counts the years that a person should live, and marks that count on a small tablet of destiny. Mortality is not a punishment alone in this tradition. It is a boundary that allows a crowd world to function. The gods learn, and humans learn, that limits can be a messy win. The alternative is ruin. You can feel the memory of real Laborbehind, these lines. Canals buckle when a flood eats at the bank. Salts creep into soil and stunt a field for seasons. The myth addresses this without preaching. It says that the decision to create a humans was a decision to share responsibility. The gods retain the high work of decree. People take on the groundwork of mental. Every time a scribe lists a crew for dredging or a builder sets a reed mat under a new course of bricks, the poem's logic is confirmed. The Atrahasis tablets that have come down to us are copies made in scribal schools in places like Sippar and Asher during the second millennium before Thecaman era. They preserve older Sumerian idioms within Adian language. The text moves with a steady hand from revolt, toppling to creation, to consequence. The tale that a god's blood is mixed into clay is not a grisly flourish. It is a statement about why humans can understand tasks and speak with the something of intelligence and authority sits in the mix. Sumerian and Adian art, when placed next to the poem, strengthens the impression thought. This was meant to explain life as it was lived. Reliefs show long files of laborers crossing a plain with baskets balanced on their shoulders. Cylinder seals show boats pulling along canal sand workers leading oxen to a early law collections from cities like Ur and Dashnona set out penalties for neglecting a canal or for moving a boundary stone to steal water. The words of law and the words of myth support each other. Everyone understood that water management was sacred work because the gods had placed that work in human hands. There is also humor in the tradition, dry and precise, that keeps the story from becoming solemn. When the Ige throw down their tools, a narrator hints that even eternal beings have their limits, and that it is no insult to admit. When the first sacrifices are offered by the new humans, the gods respond like hungry officials who have waited too long for lunch. These touches are not meant to mock. They remind use that the divine household behaves like a household, and that the sacred is not always distant thunder. The most striking consequence of the new arrangement arrives later, but its shadow falls across the creation scene. Once people thrive, their noise and smoke climb to the sky in a way that noise, the sternest of the great gods. The council debates population and policy. Enki continues to look for humane answers when others grow impatient. That next turn belongs to Theflad's story, a tale of near ending and Dunisi mercy, which deserves its own careful telling. The oldest flood story in cuneiform use not open with thunder. It opens with a complaint about noise. Humans had multiplied and their clamor rose in the night like the buzz of a marsh in high seas. Enlil, who preferred order and quiet, decided that the world had The council met. A series of measures followed that feel eerily like policy in a city that has grown too fast. First came plague. When that failed to make a lasting difference, Thegods tried famine. When famine did not quiet the world for long, they Enki, who had a soft spot for new creatures, quietly advised people on how to survive each crisis. He suggested offerings to the plague. Godto removed the pest. He suggested fishing canned grain substitutes to counter famine. He told people to dig deeper for water when the canals ran low. Each time, human ingenuity and divine sympathy blunted the blow at last. Enlil proposed a final remedy. A flood would wash the land clean. The council agreed. The gods swore an oath's half silence and bound each other not. To warn humankind, Enki found a way around the letter of that promise without breaking its spirit. He went to the house of a wise man in Shurapak, a city on the Euphrates. The man is called Atrahasis, the old Babylonian poem, and Zusudrain, earlier Sumerian tradition. In Thelator epic of Gilgamesh, he appears, a Sutna, Pishtim. Enki spoke to the wall-oft man's reed house as if it were an reed wall, listen. The wall had ears. The man listened through the wall and learned what he must do. The instructions are practical, down to the choice of materials. Tear down the house and build a boat. Abandon property and save life. Put aboard the seed of all living things. Smear the seams with bitumen so they hold. Barman was plentiful in Mesopotamia. It bubbled from the ground near Theloa rivers and was used for caulking boats and setting bricks. A riverboat cowled be made of wood and reeds, but without bum and human. It would leak like a sieve. The hero gathered carpenters, rope makers, red cutters, and pitch. He paid them well. He told fielders that the work was for the favor of the god. He loaded animals, craftsmen, and family. He took silver and gold, and every skill he could store in a hold, because after a flood, you need more than food. Then the sky turned black. In the poems, the storm god roars, and the light is. The torrent falls, with a violence that bends trees and rips levees. The foundations of the land give way. In one version, the storm lasts 6 days and 7 nights. In another, the count is different, but the effect is the same. The world becomes one broad sea. People cling to rooftops that have become rough sand, then disappear. The boat rides it out, pitching like a reed basket on a boiling pool. There is a moment in the story that tells you how the Mesopotamians imagine it their gods. While the waters rage, the gods are frightened. They cower at the edge of the sky like dogs in Athens. When the flood begins to sink, the hero opens a hatch and light pours in. He looks for land. He sends out a dove. It returns. He waits and sends out a swallow. It returns. Hooers again and sends out a raven. Theravan finds a perch and does not come back. This is the signal he needs. He opens the boat and steps onto solid. In the Sumerian version, Susudra bows toward the 4 corners and offers a sacrifice. In the Akkadian versions, Atresis and Utnapishtim do the same. They stack wood, burn sweet reeds, and pour out drink for the gods. The smell of roasting meat rises. Beatex says, the gods gather like fleece around the sacrifice. It is a comic image with a hard truth behind it. For as long as the flood lasted, there were in our offerings. The gods who had been quick to act now feel hunger, and Ishtar laments the decision. Enlil sees the smoke and realizes that some humans have survived. He is furious that the oath was bent. Enki does not deny it. He speaks up for mercy and reason. He says there are other ways to restrain a noisy world than drowning it. He proposes that human lives be shorter. He proposes gaps in fertility and limits in childbearing. The details vary from tablet to tablet, but the logic stays plain. Instead of wiping the slate cleaning rage, adjust the terms of life so that the earth can carry the weight. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtimros fees a unique reward. The gods grant them and his wife a life that does not end, and they send them to live far away at the mouth of the rivers. This is no blessing handed out to others. It is an exception that underscores the rule. Mortality will set the rhythm for everyone else. In the Sumerian zoo, Sudratali, the hero receives life like the gods and a place in the land of Dilmun, a far shore that later poets associate with purity and dawn. In all versions, the flood becomes a line in memory. Before the flood, kingship resided in a sequence of cities that now feel unreal. After the flood, it starts again in Kashund, moves through a map we can trace in archaeology. Archaeologists have looked for layers that might match the event. At Shurupakand, there are deposits of river clay that suggest a major flood in the early 3rd millennium. The layers are not uniform across the land, nor do they preprint a world ocean. But they show what people in a delta learn the hard way. Rivers can drown your city when they change course. And when Thafapan's memory calls it the flood toned all floods. The idea traveled well. The biblical story of Noah keeps Thekor plot and the sequence of birds. It drops the polytheist council and keeps a single god who judges and then promises it to repeat the act. In both traditions, a boat and a family preserve live, and a new start follows with loss and rituals to keep chaos at bay. Boat building in the poem matches what know of Mesopotamian craft. reeds bundled into strong ribs, planks, pegatogatha, ropes wound tight, seams bounded, full of pitch. The region had no forests like Lebanon, so large timbers were rare and precious. A well-made riverboat looked like a long basket with a spine. It was perfect for canals, and a storm at sea would shred it. But the hero did not need a sea. He needed a sealed box that would float over a drowned plane. Religion after the flood takes on a new. There is more attention to lament, to the careful marking of sin and restitution. When kings in latter centuries rebuilt temples, they often say they did so to restore order that had been shaken. A few texts present the idea that priestesses who serve in certain roles must not bear children, which some scholars see as a memory of new limits imposed after the flood. The span of human life in the king list drops, from the fantastic ages before the flood to plausible reigns after. The myths place a ceiling over a world that had once felt limitless. The flood story also changes. How Yahuwah, the earlier creation scene, humans were made to carry burdens that gods no longer wish to bear. The flood is the mid-course correction when the system strains. Both stories speak to a society that knew the cost of irrigation and the danger of crowding on a narrow strip of arable land. In a plain where Abraham Levy could force a city to move. You would tell your children that larger decisions have consequences, and Yawald teach them to keep their canals clear and their rituals regular. There is kindness in the tale, even with all the ruin. Enki searches for a way to Savi, a remnant. He instructs without grandstanding. He honors skill. The hero follows instructions, pays his workers, and loads not only animals and food, but tools, seeds, and craft. When the waters rest, the world restarts with a full kit. That is a Mesopotamian kind offer. It is not a promise that nothing will go wrong. It is a promise that if you plan, if you keep your accounts, and if you honor the powers above, you can rebuild even after catastrophe. In the end, the flood becomes a hinge. Before it, gods and humans test how to share a world. After it, they live with rules that both sides accept. People bring offerings with a sober understanding of why they do it. Gods accept offerings with a memory of hunger that makes them patient. Kings claim their crowns as a loan that can bear. Scribes record the years as a careful ledger of favor and fault. The river still rises each spring. The levees hold because thousands of hands keep them sound. Civilizations do not turn pages with a single gesture. They smudged them, cross them out, and write over them in a hand that looks familiar and new at once. That is who Zuma gave way to Babylon. The ancient cities on the lower rivers did not vanish, still kept moving. Nippur still guarded the idea of sacred authority. Eridustal whispered of first things, but a new center of gravity appeared on the plane, and with it a new way to tell the story of the world. Babylon began as one more city among many. Traders knew its keys. Scribes knew its measures. Then came a line of Amorite rulers who understood both law and spectacle. The most famous of them, Hammurabi, carved judgments in stone and managed alliances with a patient talent that still impresses. He knitted a tapestry of cities into something like a king. When rulers build states, priests built theologies that fit them. In Babylon, that meant lifting a local god to a position from which he could explain everything. The god was Marduk. His name had been around for centuries without special shine. Then Babylon rose and Marduk rose with it. Priests and poets took up reeds and clay and produced a creation epic 4th ages. We call it by its opening words, Enuma Elish. It begins with Abswan Tiamat, the sweet water below and the salt water above, the raw mingling from which the gods first emerged. Younger gods make noise. Abzu grows wary and plans to silence them. And from the contest comes a champion howl, put an end to chaos. In the Sumerian house, that job once belonged Ghetto powers, like Enlil or Nun. In the Babylonian retelling, Marduk steps forward. The narrative is confident, and Marduk receives the emblem Ophathority, tests his weapons, and facets Dumot, the primal sea who has birthed Ida, host of monsters, and set Kingu at their head. The duel ends with victorious certain as sunrise. Marduk splits Tiamat, sets half as the dome of Deski, and stretches the other as Thadip. He fixes the courses of planets and stars so that time can be read. Orders the calendar. He organizes winds. He appoints stations for the great light. He decides that there will be another sea and a circle of lands above it where cities can be raised and kept. A single decision in the poem tells Yahoo the Babylonians framed humanity. The older gods complain of heavy work. Marduk answers in a way that he chose, the Sumerian logic and up. He takes Kingu, the leader of their bells, and from his blood he fashions Smunkind. People will carry the labor that weary as divine shoulders. They will maintain temples, canal banks, and city walls. They will sing, count, brew, carve, and lift. In return, they will receive low-end care. It is a contract as old as Theplan, and as fresh as the new throne in Babylon. Once the world is ordered and humans are set to their tasks, the poem reaches its purpose. The great assembler recognizes Marduk as king of the gods. They give him 50 names, each a title that claims a function once associated with other powers. He is called the One Woe, establishes, decrees, the One Hornews, the one who brings life, the One Woe conquers the sea, the one who gives pasture, the one who restores cities after ruin. He is not the Skyfather, and he is not the old ruler Enlil. He is the executive power in an age that admired energy and repair. The Anunnaki in earlier ages sat as senior partners at the top, now become a wider company counted by the hundreds, and arranged under Marduk. Some lists divideth them as 300 of the heavens and 300 off the earth, a neat symmetry that would have pleased a Babylonian accountant. This was not only literature, it was liturgy and pageantry. Each spring, when fields began to green and the river settled into its channels, Babylon held the New Year festival. Statues of the gods were carried from their temples through the streets. Priests chanted the lines of Enuma Elish in halls heavy with cedar scent and lamp smoke. The king entered the temple of Marduk, the Esagula, a complex so large and layered that latter travelers thought it impossible. There he underwent a ritual that humbled and crowned him. In the same hour, the high priest stripped him of regalia and struck his cheek hard enough to draw tears. If the king wept, the omen was good. The god accepted him. He received his scepter again and led the procession to the Akichu house outside the walls. The year could begin in order. Babylon was never shy about architecture. The Temple of Marduk was joined in memory with a stepped tower that later ages called Etamani. The house that is the foundation of heaven and earth. Its bricks lifted a visiblexus between ground and sky. Generations rebuilt it after floods, and was because such a pillar told people that their city aligned with universe. The effect on visitors must have been profound. To walk those courts and hear the epic recited while the king of a growing empire stood before the statue of the new chief god. was to feel that history had tilted. None of this erased the older pantheon. It reorganized it. Enki, now called Ien Adian, remained the thoughtful consul and patron of wisdom and craft. Inanna carried on as Ishtar, brilliant and dangerous. A goddess, her could bless a city with power and turn the tide of war. Utu walked the sky as Shamash, lighting the world, and Jajin. Nana gave its silver knights as Sin, Nergal, Eroskagol, and a host of chthonic powers kept their seats below. The word Anunnaki continued to Deneteth, Great Assembly, but its center of gravity had shifted. Decision now ran through Babylon's divine court. Politics beyond the temple supported the myth. Hammurabi's laws set in neat columns beneath. A carved scene of Viking receiving a rod and ring. From Shamash announced to judges and merchants that justice had a source and a style. Canals were dredged and recut. Storehouses were tallied. Fields were azured after floods. When Babylon faltered, other powers took up versions of the same template. The Kassites, Holoter ruled from Babylon, adopted Marduk, and treated the city as a sacred trust. The Assyrians to the north lifted their own god, Asher, and wrote epics wherein Anerta or Asher stood in roles, once filled by Marduk. But when they conquered Babylon, they still stage reconciliations and restorations Beckersat city and its theology conferred a legitimacy that no army alone could supply. Texts from this era show the new arrangement working at every level. Incantations invoke Marduk and Deiatogatha as healer and counselor. Scholars compiled great omen series that rated the sky as a lettered board fromage. The gods wrote advisories each night. Priests expanded temple inventories into encyclopedias, oath offerings, gate guardians, and household writ. Scribal schools copied Inumalish and hymns that list the 50 nemesis, if memorization itself were a form of phrase. When kings rebuilt walls after a siege, they buried foundation deposits that named Marduk as the one who allowed brick and timber to meet again. The Tablet of Destinies, a symbol, a fixed authority that had flickered through earlier myth, appears with new in Assyrian and Babylonian versions of the old battles. Victoria turns the tablet to its rightful owner, without which no command holds. The lesson is clear. Legitimacy matters as much as force. A city can win a battle and still lose the year if it cannot convince heaven that the order of things has been respected. The new theology was a theory of statecraft, Asmak as cosmology. There is a practical cleverness in how Babylon framed its god. Marduk does not simply crush monsters and sit. He sits scalanders, assigns posts, names, stars, and restores cities. He models what an empire needed from its center. Thepriasts who sang his titles were telling Thea King and their people that a real ruler does not only command, he organizes. He cleans up. He remembers that a canal silted for a season can starve a district for a year. If you lay older, Sumerian tablets, beside cis Babylonian corpus, you see both continuity and change. The creation of people from a mix of divine blood and earthly material reappears with a new culprit and a new patron. The Devina Council retains its form but adjusts its seating chart. The gifts that make culture run, are now folded into the names that Marduk bears. Festivals Thatans honored many centers, now converge in one city and one ritual march. The map has been redrawn, but most of felon marks remain in daily life. The shift meant that merchants and farmers in Babylon move it through a city that claimed to be the hinge of heaven and earth. They passed through gates named for gods known across the Near East. They counted their days by a calendar that matched the epoch and the sky. They took disputes to judges who sat under reliefs of Shamash and swore oaths that called the Anunnaki and Marduk to witness. It is no surprise later ages remembered Babylon asked very idea of city. A place where power and learning met. The rise of Marduk did more than glorify a patron. It gave later generations a way to narrate their own changes. When Assyrian kings carved their triumphs on palace walls, they borrowed the imagery of dragon, slaying, and world ordering. When Persian satraps managed riverlands, they adopted the administrative habits that Babylon had refined. When Scholison, Susid, and Parthian times looked up to plot the movements of planets, they used tables that came from the same temple complexes where Enuma Elish had been chanted each spring. By the end of this chapter in the long story, the Anunnaki have not vanished. They have been absorbed into a larger imperial vision. They remain the old powers in the background while a younger champion stands at the front of their stage. The gods of Sumer are now the cabinet of Babylon. Their authority flows through a single office. Their festivals feed a single procession that carries the year on its shoulders. If Sumerians invented the template O-forwarded cosmos, the Babylonians wrote its manual and issued it with a seal. If you had asked a Sumerian farmer who the Anunnaki were, he might have said they were the high family of the sky. Ask his great-great-grandson in late Babylon, and you might hear that the Anunnaki sit in the dark and pass judgment on the dead. The name did not. The job description did. It is Sony of those long cultural turns that does not announce itself. It shows up line by line in hymns, oaths, and laments, until one day the old council of heaven is just as much a court below. The journey begins in story. In the tally of Inanna's descent, the Queen of Uruk decides to go down to the realm of her sister. She passes through 7 gates, leaves her ornaments, and stands stripped bare, the law of the underworld. There, 7 Anunnaki sit as judges. They do not bargain. They declare guilt and fix a penalty. Inanna is struck down and hung in a hook until clever help from above secures her return. The point is not cruelty. It is that the world below has rules, and those rules are guarded by sentient powers who once set the fates on high. The same firmness that kept heaven and earth in their lanes now keeps their dead where they belong. Other texts echo the change. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the heroes speak of the Anunnaki who decreed death and who now dwell with a Rashkugel. Incantations that priests used to gain stillness, and curses list the Anunnaki. The chthonic powers called towardness, oaths, and punish false swearing. Hittite treaties from the highlands bring them in as underworld enforcers. The proud old title becomes the name you invoke when you want to promise to hold a vow beyond the grave. There is a useful pairing that scribes began to use in the first millennium, e.g., for the gods of the open sky, Anunnaki for the gods beneath. The words do not appear out of nowhere. They reflect a steady sorting of the pantheon into functions that fit a world of empire and archives. The heavens fill with bright signs for scholars to read. The depths fill with judges, and warden Shwu keep the dead in order. The arrangement is neat, which was always dear to Mesopotamian hearts. To understand why this mattered, you have to picture the Mesopotamian afterlife. It was not a field of bliss. It was Adam House, called by names like Kua and Dala, where the dead lived as shades, who ate dust, unless the living remembered them. The path led through gates kept by doorkeepers with proper names. Across River Hub, where a boatman fied new arrivals, and into a city ruled by a Skegel, with Nurgle at her side. In some traditions, there were officials and scribes below, just as there were above. There was a court. There were the Anunnaki burial customs grew from this view. Families poured beer and water for their onsters at set times. They called the names of the dead so that the shades would be fed, and tablets that scholars group under the name Kisbu describe these. Other tablets warn Wuthapons when the chain breaks. A neglected dead person could return as Aristless, ghost, and trouble a house. There were rituals for that too. Priests burned juniper, spoke the names of the underworld powers, and asked the Anunnaki to judge the case and send their spirit back to its place. Graves tell the same story in clay and in the royal cemetery at early Inth tradition. The dead of high rank went down with lyres, gold leaves, and carnelian beads with oxen, and a tendency airy pageant that looks extravagant until you remember the logic. Two live well below, one needed a fraction of hut, one had above. Later, burials, airless lavish, but often include bowls, lamps, and small tools. These are not random keepsakes. They are tokens of care for a journey that every to make. The Anunnaki show up in legal texts as guarantors of boundaries and oaths, Kassite and Babylonian. Boundary stones, the Kadru stones, carved with signs of God's call on the Anunnaki, too. Kursianyon, who moves a marker or falsifies a. The curse lists are formulaic and may the Anunnaki of the earth and the sky blind the offender. May they cut off his seed. May they make his house error. It sounds harsh, because propertylines in a canal land are if you respect the edge of a field, the courts above will favor you. If you do not, the courts below stand ready to finish the case. Laments belong here as well. When citiesful poets sang long, sad poems that describe the departure of patron gods, gates broken, and fires in courtyards. These laments often end with a hope that gods will return, and that the Anunnaki will soften. The poems they were a way to ask deepest authorities to reverse a fate. When a new ruler rebuilt a temple, he buried a tablet at the foundation, asking the Anunnaki to watch over and to punish anyone who dared tondo the work. The underworld court appears in rituals that cleansed omens and reset bad luck. The Namburbi texts are handbooks for rundoing ill signs. If a house crack looks like a bad token or a dog howls in a pattern that bodes is ill, the ritual tells you what to burn, what to bury, and which gods to address, so that Thussen does not ripen into fate. The underworld powers are part of this machinery. Once the Anunnaki have written a decision, it stands. If Yah went to prevent a bad decision, you act before the writing hardens. The mindset is legal and almost bureaucratic, even when it is spiritual. One god becomes a focus as the dark realm gains detail. Nurgle, a Fearsalid associated with plague and war, pairs with his king below in latter myths tell of his rough courtship and his descent to her throne. He is not an Anunnaki by birth in Theold lists, yet he works with them in Thassum court. It is a reminder that title shifted as duties grew. The old family Nami attached to the bench of judges. New officials took chairs beside them, asked stories of empire, demanded a full staff. The seven shows up again and again. 7 gates, 7 judges, The number had symbolic weight across Mesopotamia. It organized lists and festivals. It also gave structure to dread. To passive in checkpoints is to pass a completist. To face 7 judges is to foresee the full court. In spells and hymns, naming the 7 Anunnaki of the underworld was a way to say that you had consulted every authority that mattered by the late 1st millennium, scribeslove to catalogue. Scholarly tablets list names and epithets of underworld binds with a neatness that almost hidest fear behind the writing. There are reedmans who guard thresholds, storm spirits who hunt the wicked, and recorded names for judges who hear suits brought by the dead. The Anunnaki are listed among these with their old gravitas intact. A learned priest could enroll a tablet and speak the right names in the right order to fit any case. Cylinder seals from workshops in Menicities pictured the seated deity handing a rod and ring to a human official. They were small, but they carried the same message as the law codes and the hymns. Authority is measured and given. The old idea of a high court that sets fates was not an abstraction to the people who made these things. It was the frame of their lives. Not every find fit neatly. For a time, there was debate about how to count the Anunnaki and which names to include in our. One text suggested hundreds sorted by heaven and earth. Another showed a solemn group of 7 in the underworld. Assyriologists learned not to force a single list onto centuries of changing practice. The term worked like a title that cities and periods applied in related ways. That is what living religions do. They carry a few strong ideas across generations and let details breathe by mid-century. The outlines of the older world were plain enough to teach town to ground. The earliest cities grew in the Euro period. Writing began with account keeping and flowered into literature. Sumerian and Audiancoextad for centuries an influency deck. Other. The divine household had a structure that mirrored civic life. The Anunnaki began as the children of their ski father and the earth. Then becometh senior assembly that set destinascent in later imagination, sat as judge. The flood myth travelled in Tolata traditions. The Babylonian creation story elevated a city and its god, without tearing down the whole house of older belief. It was a web of facsand texts strong enough to hold weight. Outside of universities, interest grew as well. Museum galleries drew crowds with lions from gates and reliefs of kings hunting. Translations of Gilgamesh reached general readers. Teachers could point to a clay tablet and say, "Here is where a scribe pressed a sign 4,000 years ago and meant something we can read." The distance between a modern reader and a Sumerian tablet. On days when the translation caught a joke or a sigh, a hymn might praise a god for bringing fresh water to parched fields, and a visitor who had watered a garden from a hose in Julie would nod. The rediscovery was not a straight climb. Wars interrupted fieldwork. Collections were scattered or damaged. Sites eroded, while permits were debated. Yet the story kept advancing because theses were stubborn. Clay breaks. Butit keeps writing better than papyrus, or a city that burned might leave behind a baked library. A fallen war could seal rooms for later hands to pen. Every season that teams reached Neto, the ground brought another set of tablets to read and catalogue. Each new start felt like a conversation resumed by the close of the century. A reader walked into a good library could find entire series devoted to Mesopotamian religion and mythology. There were bilingual editions that put transliteration on one page and translation on the next. There were dictionaries to untangle Sumerian compounds and Adian verb stems. There were atlases that traced the changing courses of the rivers. In those books, the Anunnaki stood where they belonged, not as a curiosity, but as a core idein, how the people of the first city recognized the unseen. The long silence had ended in a chorus of small voices on clay. They told of a world where gods and people negotiate work and fate, where a council sits rules, where old titles gathered nudities, and where an ancient word for a royal family became a term for highest court in every realm. The Anunnaki had been lost, and then they were found, not as legends alone, but as lines and seals and bricks that you could hold in your hand. Once the tablets began to speak in modern languages, most readers were content to marvel at the poetry, theological wit, and the stubborn practicality of the first cities. A few readers wanted something more explosive. They looked at gods who came from the sky and wondered if the sky meant what they think it means. That is how the Anunnaki moved from seminar rooms into late-nightal vision, and the brighter corners are for imagination. The first big push came from writers who like to ask whether ancient monuments required outside help. In the 1960s, a Swiss hotelier named Eric Fondon filled pages with photos and questions. Did old stones show rockets? Did old myths describe machines? He wandered from Peru to Egypt and back to Mesopotamia, pointing and asking. His books sold in Greek numbers because the idea is, if the ancients were talking to visitors from the stars, then Wemadans are part of a grand cosmic club. Little of it stood up to close inspection, but the appetite for wonder was real. The leap that put the Anunnaki at the center came next. In the 1970s, Science published a book with a bold claim. He said the Sumerians did not only tell myths, they recorded his story from a time when a wandering planet swept near the Earth on a long, colder bit. He called that world Nibiru. He said its people were the Anunnaki. They came for gold to fix their They found early humans and saw potential. Enki, recast as a scientist with wet clay on his hands, worked out how to mix divine blood with stock of a clever primate. Their salt was us. He said the table sowed all of this for readers who knew how to look. It was a grand story. It felt like science because it used the language of planets and genes. It felt like theology base. It gave purpose to creation and a role to gods, who now had star charts. It also felt a little like a detective atoll, because only a few could supposedly had the clues. Readers by the millions bought the idea. More books followed. A generation later, television producers found a format that made these claims live. A camera could sweep across a ziggurat while a narrator spoke of visitors who brought writing and lore. The word Anunnaki became a password. Say it, and you announced that you were in Onan, enormous secret. There was a second track alongside the spectacle. Scholars raised their hands and asked to return to the tablets. They pointed out that Nibiru in the Latin astronomical texts is a title that can mark a planet like Jupiter or the crossing place of the sky. They showed that Anunnaki in the earlier myths refers to the high circle of gods and not to travelers from cold space. They noted that creation from clay with divine blood is a ritual explanation for why humans can speak to the gods and note a laboratory note. They also reminded readers that orbits obey math and that a large hidden world swinging through every few millennia would tug the rest off the systemed in ways we would have measured long ago. The divide between the two camps widened wind dates were tied to prophecy. As the year 2012 approached, some predicted that the wandering world would return, that old gods would stand again on their platforms, or at least that the sky would misbehave. Astronomers gave interviews with the patience of schoolteachers. There is no rogue planet, they said. If there were, amateurs with small telescopes would have photographed ideas in advance. The year came and went with the usual share of storms and The old tablets stayed put in their cases. The fact that these ideas keep returning says something kind about us. People want meaning on a large scale. The Mesopotamians wanted it too. They found it in a council that set fates, a contract between gods and cities, and a map where every gate had a guardian. Modern readers, who are not satisfied with human slow work, sometimes look for a faster spark. Aliens become a substitute for divine will. Rockets stand in for thrones. The Anunnaki fit easily into that frame because they already carry the weight of origin stories. There is a third path through the modern maze. It sits between debunking and belief. This path treats the ancient texts as human documents that can be read with care, and it allows wonder without surrendering to fantasy. On this path, the flood story tells us about a land that lived with rivers as both gift and threat. The creation of people to carry baskets says something honest about societies that run on organization. The descent to the underworld shows how grief is given structure, when the dead must be kept close by name and be offering. The Anunnaki on this path are not spacemen. They are the way Asity made sense of power, justice, and limits that does not stop the pop culture borrowings, and perhaps it should not. Fiction lives on what if. A novelist hopes an Anunnaki on a lonely shore and gives him a memory of stars is writing in the same spirit that let it Sumerian sing of a moon god who rides a boat across the night. What matters is that we know which shelf we are on. Myth can't playful and still be true to its. Pseudoshans pretends to be Emmanuel and then asks to be graded on charm. One persistent aside deserves an answer because it has caused more heat than. Some writers have connected the Anunnaki with biblical hints about Sunsif, God, and giants. It is easy to draw threads across texts if you use only the sound of words. The careful way is to follow the languages and the dates. Ideas do travel. Flood stories surely did. But Mesopotamian gods are not simply rebadged figures in later books. They have their own history. They live in a very specific world of canals, barley, and baked brick. Their stories do not need a later scaffolding. If you walk back to the tablets after Ator, through the modern claims, they feel steadier than ever. A scribe in an old Babylonian schoolroom writes, "Fat people were made so that the gods would not have to dig." A hymn in Sumerian praises Enlil for setting fates. A list of offerings says that 50 loaves and 10 jugs of beer were given to the high circle at new moon. A boundary stone calls on the Anunnaki to punish a thief of land. None of these lines require aspership to make sense. They require asity, where everyone knows that work must be shared and that promises must hold. The more you read, the more the Medenditas look like a mirror for current hopes and fears. Fear that our knowledge is not enough. Hope that we are part of a wider story. These are fair feelings. The ancients had them too. They answered with temples, calendars, and councils. We answer with telescopes, party clacerators, and sometimes with mass-market paperbacks that move quickly off the shelf. In both cases, the craving is the same. We want to see the frame, There is no harm in enjoying a television hour where someone points out a relief and says, perhaps there is harm when speculation is sold as translation. The best corrective is not scolding. It is reading. Read an account, tablet, that lists the rations for a canal crew. Anthem, read the lines in a treatise, whereth gods decide that people will carry baskets. Read the lament for a felicity, and stand in front of a burned bricklayer in an excavation trench. Read a hymn to Inanna, and walk the plan of Uruk, where her temple stood. The old stories will earn your trust without help. In the end, the modern life of the Anunnaki has two branches. In one, they are managers of a universe that runs on decree, offering, and measured time. In the other, they are travelers from a far world who left us a mixed inheritance of freedom and servitude. The first branches backed by clay and context, thickened by wish and rhetoric. Both are in no part of cultural memory. Only one needs a glossary. The word Anunnaki was once a scholar's term that lived mostly in footnotes and seminar rooms. Then something changed. A minor caste of ancient deities walked onto the bright stage of modern culture and found themselves playing every role from cosmic mentor to secret overlord. It did not happen in a single season. It was a steady drift powered vision paperbacks, message boards, and the simple fact that old story estravel, well, when you give them a fresh fickle. The first stop was television that promised revelations. After the next commercial break, producers learned that a camera loves ruins, especially if you flee past them at sunset and add a drumbeat. A narrator could whisper that the stones hold a secret and then show a tablet covered in wedge marks. Scholar Shad said for years that those marks recorded hymns, laws, and daily. The new programs asked if they also recorded visitors from the sky. The question was the hook. You did not need an answer to feel the lure. Epicidis multiplied. Cities like Uruk and Urbik came recurring characters. Ziggurat stood in 4 launch towers. The word Nunaki gained a sparkle it had never worn when it was only a line in a hymn. Publishers kept pace. Big paperbacks with glossy inserts promised a key to oldest mysteries. Dust jackets featured reliefs of kings with wings, cylinder seals enlarged to billboard size, and starfields drifting behind that title. In these pages, the Anunnaki be wise teachers, stern geneticists, or a dynasty that never really left. Chapters blended real photographs with captions that suggested new meanings. The method was simple. Take a known object, add a provocative gloss, and let reader do the rest. Museums saw a ripple effect. Visitors came with questions that jumped across millennia a single breath. A guide might begin with the irrigation of the lower river sand, arrive at a debate about a wandering world. Beyond Neptune, before the group had reached the second case, the internet opened 1,000 side doors. Early forums hosted long threads where people traded translations, drawings, and dreams. Amateur archivists scanned old articles and posted them with comments. Someone would quote a line from a tablet. Someone else would link to a satellite team of a mound in Iraq and ask what lay beneath. Videos stitched together stock footage started with the words, "What if?" A subculture of explainers emerged, thickened of people who can talk for an hour with an earnest calm that almost. The Anunnaki became a password in these spaces. Use it and use it that you are willing to entertain very large stories about human origins and destinies. Games and fiction joined in. Writers love a ready-made pantheon. The name Anunnaki sounds old and rich, even if you cannot place it on a map. Game designers borrowed the mood. A role-playing rulebook might list the Anunnaki as an ancient faction whose relics grant strange powers. A science fiction novel might place a hidden base under a desert cigarette and imagine a signal that wakes after a long dormancy. Comic artists drew tall figures with horned crown stepping from a shaft of light while human onlookers shielded their eyes. None of this claimed to be history. It was the kind of play that myth invitation it leaves. The classroom. Music and art took their turn. A band named an album for a skyfather. A lyricist woe, a flood, and a lost city into a chorus that crowds could chant. Tattoo artists learned to translate a favorite cuneiform sign into clean lines. Street murals put a winged figure on a brick wall beside a spray-painted planet. A safe to say that the most ancient stories still want to say in modern weather. Pop culture is a net that catches wocklants. The Anunnaki began to glint. Conventions made the movement social. In hotel ballrooms and community centers, speakers took the stage with slides that moved from excavations to star charts. In the lobby, vendors sold paperbacks, replica seals, and meteorite fragments the size of a thumbnail. In one corner, a retired engineer explained to a teenager how a reed boat might behave on a sudden flood. In another, a podcast recorded interviews about a possible return date for an object no observatory had tracked. The gathering was part chance fair, part revival, and part book club. Most people came for the thrill of an idea that linked the first cities to the far future. Museums adapted, curators learned to anticipate questions that were not in the wall text. They wrote labels that explained how a scribe held a reed and why a table broke the way it did. They added a panel that said what Nibiru means in the late star lists and why scholars do not use seat for a hidden planet. Docents practiced clear answers that respected curiosity while pointing back to the evidence in the case. Some exhibitions staged a gentle debate by placing a tablet of the flood beside a map of ancient river channels, an photo of a modern levee. The effect was to show that myth, environment, and memory form a braid rather than a riddle box. Schools also felt the ripple. Teachers found that a lesson on Mesopotamia drew more attention when it acknowledged Thepapoke culture version and then used the interest to teach how we know what when. A class might read a short passage from a treatise and then try to design a simple boat out of reeds and paper, to carry a handful of grain across a tub. Another day they might examine a boundary stone and write a modern contract that borrows its language. The word Anunnaki becomes a doorway to the real daily world of barley, brick, and debt. The wildest corners of the web offer redder performances. Some turned the Anunnaki into a set of masked rulers, hopple strings behind elections and bank. Others fused them with saints, demons, or hidden bloodlines. The pattern is familiar. Take a term that carries age and authority. Detach it from context and let it absorb whatever a moment fears or craves. In this mode, the Anunnaki are a mirror that reflects modern suspicion. When institutions disappoint, a story about unseen hands can feel like an answer, even if it leaves you more anxious than before. Meanwhile, a quieter current has grown. Independent translators post side-by-side renderings of short hymns. Digital projects build searchable corpora atlas. Anyone look up a word in a line from a tablet and see every other place eat. Documentary filmmakers spend time with archaeologists in the field and show how a square meter of soil can give up 3 tablets that change how we date a local ruler. In these works, the Anunnaki return to their original relasis, a label for the highest council, and later for the judges below. The drama is still there, but it belongs to a living discipline that can say when a claim fits the clay and when it does not. If there is a reason that Anunnaki have found a permanent niche in popular culture, it is that they answer to appetites at once. They offer theremins of the first cities with their processions, towers, and glittering gorings. They also offer a cosmic script that can be rewritten to taste. You can cast themers, guardians, or as tyrants, as teachers, sir, as creditors. Their very flexibility is what carrieth term through. Ancient centuries astutes shifted from sky to underworld. The same flexibility carries the term through. Modern media, as it moves from a to a headline and back again, the risk is confusion, but there is also a gain. People would never have thought about Sumer, now look up Kuni, form and learn the difference between Sumerian and Adian. A viewer who arrives for a grand story about lost knowledge may stay long enough to learn why a calendar metasto, a farmer, how a canal roster was kept fair, and what it meant to swear by the names of the old high court. If the costies that a museum guard has to smile through one more question about a hidden planet, that seems a price worth paying. The path from obscurity to spotlight has lived the Anunnaki with a double life. They are still the elders who set destinies in tablets and who sit in judgment below. They are also symbols that modern creators use to signal diff and mystery. The first is anchored in clay and brick and the long memory Ophir Riverland. The second floats in a sea of screens. Both will likely remain because the old stories are generoshosts and modern. Culture never stops looking for a stage. If you want to see how a modern society wrestles with ancient stories, go to 3 places in one afternoon. Start in a university seminar room where a professor of astrobiology writes wedge signs on a whiteboard and explains how a single mark can change meaning when itis turned a quarter turn. Walk next to a planetarium where an astronomer shows ASCII full of tracked objects and explanatory. Wandering worlds reveal themselves long before they arrive. Finish in a museum conservation lab where a specialist in broken clay coaxes a new line out of a tablet with a brush and a light. Between these rooms, you will watch a myth pass through scrutiny, not to flatten it, but to find its proper size. Academic skepticism begins with ancient words are not puzzlesto, be solved once and for all. They are reliving items that change context by erond, by city. Take Nibiru in late Babylonian star lists. It can name a crossing point in the sky or a planet that serves as a marker for sea. It is not a separate world trying to hide behind the Sunday. The word Anunnaki behaves in the same way. In Sumerian hymns, it names the high circle of gods who set destinies in first millennium incantations. It canon the judges below. Neither use adjoints to a population of miners from deep space. These facts are not opinions. They are the product of thousands of tablets read in sequence with a habit of asking what a term means in a given text, rather than what it might mean in an argument. Philology has a plain grace. A scholarly's out parallel passages and shows that a phrase about mixing clay with God's blood recurs in contexts that discuss cult birth and the gift of speech. The point is not to sneer at imaginative readings. It is to show that ancient authors wrote within traditions that we can trace. A line that sits beside a hymn in one tablet and a ritual in another does not suddenly become alab note when moved to a coffee Table book. Good skepticism is careful, loyal, Tito sources. Archaeology adds ground under the words. Excavations at cities like Uruk, Nepal, and Babylon reveal layers of rebuilding, shifts in river courses and rooms fill it with. The everyday kit of Life. Foundation deposits under new wall scary prayers that ask the old High Court to guard the work. Boundary Stone Asoman, the same court to curse any own woe, moves a marker. The physical record explains why the gods are so often a skedto, watch canals, and enforce property. It does not hide a hangar or a landing pad. If someone wanted to argue for ships in a marsh, the least they could do is show a bolt or a shard of an alloy the regen did not know. None has appeared. Astronomy closes the gate on the grandest of modern claims. The solar system is a neighborhood that has been surveyed by professionals and by hobbyists who do not mind losing sleep. Large bodies announce themselves. They take on planets we already track. They glow in infrared surveys. Their paths can be simulated on a laptop and compared to what we see through glass. When people predict that a hidden jaunt will swoop near the Earth, astronomers do not scoff. They measure. When the measurement returns empty, they say so. The wonder of the real sky does not suffer for lack of drama. It offers comets that shed tails like chalk and planets with moons. That eclipse in patterns so crisp you can set a clock. Totem, scientists and scholars also keep an eye on the ways ideas spread. Claims about a dangerous object with no coordinates have a pattern. The date shifts when the day passes. The evidence is always one layer removed. The believer says, a friend knows someone new who worked at a facility that saw some methane that cannot be shown. In such cases, the calm reply is to invite a look through a telescope, a visit to a public sky survey, and a review of Herbert's work. A general audience can learn the essentials of celestial metrics faster than you might think, once you understand why a long periodont would have battered the inner system for eons. You stop expecting Ito Tiptoe past in a single season. None of this means those old stories are as... The flood tale is not a weather report, but it is a way to remember the truth of living in a delta where a river can shift and drown a generation. The creation of people to carry baskets is not a laboratory scene, but it is actionist about labor and ration as any modern budget. The descent to the underworld does not draw a map, but it gives shape to grief and explains why families poured beer for their dead when the month turned. A myth holds wisdom when it stays where it belongs. You can see the health of a field in how it treats disagreement. Assyriology is surprisingly cheerful about debate. Editors publish new collations that correct old readings. A toblet that once seemed to say one thing shows another when a lost corner to. Arguments play out in footnotes, with a dry humor that hides real passion for getting a line right. Even the larger conclusions adjust over time. A century ago scholars wrote about fixed pantheons. Today, they speak of divine households that shift by city and by people, which gives you a richer view. A name like Anunnaki can travel from sky to the deep dot. There is also a lesson in humility that comes from the tablets themselves. Clay is fragile, yet it outlives empires. A temple burns and the heat bakes alabri into durability. A flood knocks down a wall and seals a star room where Akla last stacked a set of loans. When we wrote, we are not only learning about gods. We are seeing how human beings in a hard place made systems that lasted. Scribes invented a way to number time that still governs our days. Surveyors set boundary marks that lasted through dynasties. Priests greeted calendars that moved crowds in step. These achievements stand whether or not anyone ever looked down from another world, that the legacy of the Anunnaki in modern life is therefore a double thread. Ononi Strand, the name is a teaching tool. It leads students toward the first cities, the first ledgers, and the first grand attempts to put justice in. On the other, the name has become a canvas for new stories that say something about our own anxieties and wishes. Both strands will continue. One stays anchored to clay and the other floats and changes skiller with each decade. It may be that endurance of the old term depends on that flexibility. A living culture finds suitors for an ancient label even when the original owners might not recognize Thepet. What matters is that we keep the category straight. When a museum label tells you that a tablet is a hymn tonelil, recorded in Sumerian and copied in Akkadian, that is a piece of knowledge hard won. When a late-night host tells you that the same hymn is a veiled description of a machine that is, enjoy the show, but do not put it in a footnote. The ancient authorize their respect. They built a world in words that explained why cities rise and fall, why work must be shared, and we promises bind. They named a high council that fixed destinies, and they later pictured that council as a bench of judges below. That is quite a nugrinder for one tradition. If you want a last test of how mythensians can coexist without quarrel, go back to the planetarium after dark. A guide dims the lights and brings up their ski of a spring night over the lower rivers 4,000 years ago. The constellations look both strange and familiar. The moon rises. A line appears that marks the path of Jupiter as it would have moved that month. The guide quotes an omen that links the bright god to good harvest if a wind blows from a given quarter. Then the guide explains show the planet loops against the background stars because of the Danso 4 orbits. No one in the room feels the old line and the new explanation sit together as neatly as an offering bowl inside a brick shrine. The Anunnaki keep their seat in memory. Deski keeps its beauty. We keep our appetite for both. Walk into a quiet room with a single clay tablet on its stand, and you can feel the distance between us and the first cities shrink to nothing. The marks are small and tidy. A list of offerings, a hymn, a king's boast. Somewhere behind it stands a priest, who counted loaves at dawn, or a scribe, who copied a line until it sounded right, out of this plain material. The people of the lower rivers built a map of Duin scene that they called the work of the Anunnaki. It explained why days had shape and why rulers needed limits. It said that destinies were spoken in a court that stood above human quarrels. It was practical spirituality, and it proved durable. The old stories are not random legends stacked one on another. They are a joined system. The separation of sky and earth gives the world structure. The council of the high gods sets fates, so that kingship and calendar have weight. The creation of people answers a labor problem and justifies a social order where canal rosters and temple rations matter. The flood resets the balance. One growth outruns the land's patience, then leaves a promise that life will continue within a narrower span. The descent to the realm of the dead teaches that grief can be managed if the living remember the names of their own. Each episode solves a problem that a city faces and turns it into a story that can be repeated at festivals and read in quiet rooms. When we say mythology, we sometimes mean a cloud of fancy. In Mesopotamia, it was also a handbook. The me are notonoments in a poem. They are a catalogue of powers that make a city work. from plows and weaving to truth and kingship. The Anunnaki are not a parade of caprice. They are a council that grantes, that decisions echo across the years, and not only days. Even the grandest moments carry a Clark's sense of what must be tallied. When Anunnakari's culture, home by boat, share turns with real institutions. When a boundary stone calls on the High Court to curse a thief, it is enforcing a fence line that keeps a harvest safe. This clarity is why Mesopotamian myth traveled so well. Traders carried it upriver. Conquerors repackaged it for their own capitals. Scribes adapted the caste as duties shifted. The Hittites borrowed the idea of elder gods confined below by a younger order. The Babylonians promoted a city god to chieftain, gave him the task of setting the sky in measurable paths. The Hebrews lived within reach of the same river-shaped, a flood story that kept the bones off an older tale and placed it in a new frame of one God and a covenant. Motives crossed languages with the ease of a caravan on a good road because the needs they met were the same. Every society must think about work and authority and catastrophe and loss. A modern reader can move between these eretlings and watch a new thing happen. Myth becomes a way to compare how cultures answer the same question in different rooms. Why does power belong to some and not to others? Sumer saist office descends from heaven and is ratified in a sacred city. Babylon says a god who rebuilds the world earns Therit to rule the rest. Israel says, a single creator binds kings to justice and remembers the poor. The argument is centuries, long and entirely civil on Thepage. Each tradition hands down a set of stories and expects citizens to live with the consequences. There is a pleasure in how concrete the Mesopotamian system stays, even at its most cosmic. Ziggurats are not abstract ladders. They are bricks that lift a ritual to a height where a procession can be seen across a city. A calendar is not a metaphysical diagram. It is a schedule for canals, sowing, and harvest that people chant so everyone shows upon time. Omens do not turn people into puppets. They turn attention outward, Toski and wind, so that decisions are made with care. The Anunnaki sit above Buthi, never float away from streets where millstones turn and barges nose through a narrow lock. If you ask what gives these myths their staying power, the answer is that they keep their feet on the ground, while their eyes are on the horizon. They admit that the world is perilous, and that the best you can do is share burdens, and keep your promises in the sight of witnesses who will outlast you. They give a name to fate, but leave room for argument and mercy in the figure of a god who looks for humane paths when rules chafe. They praise order, but do not pretend that order is free. Someone must clean the silt from a canal. Someone must sing a lament when a city falls. The stories do not excuse those tasks. They honor them. They also acknowledge limits without spare. Mortality arrives after their flood, not as a curse only, but as a boundary that makes society bearable. The afterlife is no prize, yet the living can comfort the dead with kings may boast, but every tablet that records a grant also calcin the highest court to punish future fraud, which is a quiet confession that power needs breaks. A tradition that says such things is not just old, it is mature when the Anunnaki step into modern imagination as aliens or secret patrons. We are watching a familiar human move. We take an elder symbol for order and fit it to fresh anxieties. Sometimes that is playful and generous. Sometimes it is a shortcut that mistakes wonder for evidence. Either way, Thetum endures because it remains a useful vassal for awe. A writer can put it in a sentence, and readers will sense that something large is at stake, even if they cannot say why. The better use is to let the old idea do the job it was built for. Treat Anunnakius, the name for the High Council, in a world that believed the universe runs on rules that cities must honor. Read Ahime to Anello, and then look at the Plan of Nepa, where petitions were brought. Read the flood story, and then look, a silt band in a trench, read a boundary curse, and then walk along Amadorn Levy and feel in your body why a line matters. The myths are not there to escape reality. They are there to bind reality together with clear language and shared memory. There is one last way in which these stories are modern. They encourage a habit of transparency. Decisions must be spoken in public. Oaths must name witnesses, divine and human. Rituals should be regular and visible. You could almost say that fine invention of accountability begins here, in the insistence that a fate is not a whim, but a decree that can be heard and weighed. When later cultures adopt written law and public festival, they are building on ground that the first cities stamped with wedges. So when you stand in that quiet room and the tablet on the stand still looks small, remember what it contains. A belief that time is countable, a conviction that work is a shared trust, a fear of flood and famine, offset by a stubborn faith that order can return if cities rebuild and gods forgive, an annum for a council that guarantees that words have weight. The Anunnaki serve not because they are glamorous, but because the world still needs what they're prepriment. If you strip the gold from theory masks, roll up the painted wall, relief sand, set aside the grand names, what remains is a set of worries and hopes that look very familiar. Rain in season, children who live, work that counts, a fair hearing when trouble comes. The Anunnaki myth cycle is a long conversation about those things. It is a human story that tried to make the unpredictable seem bearable and theodinary feel worthy of ceremony. Start with work. The earliest poems never pretend that labor is noble because it is easy. They say directly that irrigation is hard and that Sumerian must carry baskets. They then give that burden a frame. If people were made to take up the tasks that gods could not stomach forever, then toil is not a failure of planning. It is a founding choice. That sounds stern until you see the comfort it offers. The farmer on a levee at noon can imagine himself in Sadia plan that begins before memory. The temple rationalist is not only bookkeeping, it is participation in Thesum compact that the first god sealed with clay and blood meaning arrives in a bowl of beer counted out. By a clerk one knows your name. Move to law. The habit of swearing oaths be, the High Court makes justice Marathan whim. When a scribe writes a boundary grant and calls the Anunnaki to witness, he is trying to tie a local quarrel to the oldest authority in the world. He is also protecting future strangers. A tablet buried under Amaka stone speaks for anyone who is not yet born, so that a field remains a field when memories have thinned. This is a small miracle of foresight. It is the beginning of a tradition that says dead and the unborn both have claims that the living must respect. Consider grief. The Mesopotamian tale is dim and spare, yet the living refuse to let it be lonely. They pour beer for their dead, bring bread, and speak names aloud so that the shades will feel remembered. The Anunnaki, as judges below, are not frightening. They are a guarantee that stories do not end in a ditch. A life is weighed, a wrong can still be marked, and a right can still count. When a family keeps the month right, they are not trying to buy favor. They are insisting that connection endures across the river. In a world without Antibiotics or rescue helicopters, That insistence is a humane triumph. Think about power. Kings march through texts with more ceremony than most of us can stomach. But beneath their parades sits a rule that cuts them down to size. Kingship is alone. It descends. It can be revoked. If a ruler fails, poets will say that city god walked out of the temple, which is a polite way of saying that legitimacy has left the building. The Anunnaki, in their bright court, are Thebord, that can say enough. You can call this mythology, but you can also call if birth of constitutional thought written in clay instead of parchment. Now watch how the stories train attention, omens, lead people to look up and outward, not to freeze in fear. Buto gather more information before. A moon ring and a wind from Thewist mean that it is not a good weak topic, a fight in the hills. An odd birth in a cowherd warns of strain in their year ahead, so strengthen the canal banks. Today, we call this risk management. The Anunnaki frame. Turn Shabbat into policy by claiming that WA sends consistent signals and that careful people can read them. The method is often wrong by modern standards, but the posture is admirable. It says that decisions should be informed, not impulsive. We can also see a steady tenderness for craft. Enki is the patron of clever hands. Ninharag is the patron of life that is well made. The me include weaving, carpentry, music, and brewing. These are not frills. They are ranked with truth and victory because they keep a city alive and make it worth living in. A boat builder who knows how to caulk a seam is an agent of divine order. Isinger, who remembers the right lament, keeps a community honest about loss. When the Anunnaki bless a project, they are blessing skills as much as outcomes. There is a lesson about limits that feels bracing rather than bleak. After the flood, the span of human life is shortened, not to punish, but to prevent the world from choking on success. This is ecological thinking before the word existed. The council chooses a challenge so that the system can persist. Modern readers hear an echo of ration books and water tables. The ancients heard a boundary that restored sleep to gods and rest to the earth. Either way, the ideas, the same. Enough is a virtue. Too much can break the very thing you love. The myths also refuse to make virtue simple. Enlil stands for authority, and Samartims swings too hard. Enki stands for mercy, and sometimes bends rules Tosovi lives. Inanna stands for desire and ambition, which can build cities and start wars. Utu stands for justice, and is asked to read hearts as well as tablets. These portraits are influencing. No god is a cartoon. No impulse is pure. A reader learns to value balance and to mistrust any single quality that claims to rule alone. Bring the camera closer and you can see daily scenes that the stories sang to fill without fuss. A brewer skim foam in a courtyard and tips the first cup on the ground for the god. A canal crew breaks in the shade to eat dates and flatbread, then returns to lift baskets in a chain that runs like a drum beat. A shepherd calls his flock from a levee as a scribe waits with a stylus to tally the count. A midwife dips a cloth in cool water while a family murmurs a hymn to the mother of all living. When the High Council blesses the city, it is their tasks that grow easier for a season. Myth gives them a frame and a thank you. Even war is brought within rules. Before a campaign, kings consult omens and priests. They make offerings and swear that they will spare. When the season ends, they hang up weapons and mark a festival that mends civic life. The Anunnaki do not ban violence, they domesticate it. They require that power answer to expectation. If that sounds naive, remember how many modern states still need rituals to shepherd troops home, Anto Renit, a city after strain. The human story also includes a taste for second chances. The flood ends with regret and a new plan rather than a boast. Inanna returns from the underworld row, a negotiated substitution that keeps the rules while letting live presume even curses. On boundary stones include a line that says, "The gods will loose anyone who restores what was broken." Mercy threads through the hard talk, because people cannot live on law alone. It is easy to think that belief in a council of gods belongs to a distant past. Then you notice how much of our life still echoes the older pattern. Companies and courts sit in rooms and decree outcomes that shape years fought houses. We build calendars that tell us when to plant, when to pay, when to gather, and when to rest. We keep ledgers and expect strangers to annul them. We pour drinks for absent friends' hand, speak names at graves. We hope that Sumerian, beyond the room, keeps a record of what was fair and what was mean. Thelabels have changed. The habits have not. What the Anunnaki offer, in the end, is not a set of exotic images, but a way to match human scale to cosmic scale. They make it possible to say that a loaf of food in a side chapel and the path of Jupiter. Across the month, both belong Tuths, same order. They make it possible, to believe, that a law carved in stone and apria, whispered at night, both carry weight, because both are answered in places that outlast any one life. That belief steadied people who lived with fickle rivers and capricious kings. It can steady us as well if we translate its terms with care. So the human story behind the Anunnakis, not really about gods. It is a Booth choice to live as if words matter, as if work is holy when shared, as if limits are a gift, and as if memory binds living and the dead. The first cities pinned those choices to clay. Thetablaze are small, but they keep speaking. If you want to test whether the Anunnaki are only words, take a map and go where our names first made sense. The story lives in places. It breathes in thighs of riverbeds and the smell of baked brick after rain. A myth that began as in temples still has addresses. Start at Eridu, far to the south. Wereth, ancient shoreline, once Lapidagan's low ground. Here the Sumerian said, Enki kept house at the meeting, off sweet water and salt. Archaeologists found a stack of temples, one built over another, like chapters placed on a Each layer carried an altar, an aplan that grew a little more ambitious than the one beneath it. Stand there, Anju, understand why a god of wisdom would live at a margin between worlds. The sound of reeds in a breeze is a quiet listen in beginnings. Move north to the ziggurat rises frond plain with the stubborn pride of a spuva. Woolly cleared its stairway sand, found the royal cemetery near beware gold, lapis, and carnelian lay with lyres and carts in a pageant or farewell. You can trace the route of a funeral party in your head. Musicians led, attendants followed. A queen descended a chamber furnished as if for an evening that would never end. The logic was clear. The underworld needs civility, too. When hymns speak of judges below, they do so in a culture thought. Packed a lamp and a cup for Uruk still sprawls like a small country. It once held districts for Inanna and Dan, with platforms and halls that could hold crowds whose voices would roll like surf across sunlit brick. Burek gave us writing and the first argument about what a city is for. Walk its mounds, and you can almost hear the clicks of styluses and the creak of floated carts in lanes lined by mud walls. When a tale says that in an old home with the gifts of culture, Uruk is the city she made worthy of the cargo. Nepa looks modest. From a distance, a tangle of mounded earth with baked brick peeking through. But this was the seat of Enlil, and the place where kings sought the right to rule. The year precinct gives the idea of a cosmic council, a floor plan. Courts, stirrooms, stairways, and altars are pieces of a working campus, where petitions rose with incense and clay tablets moved like momos between rooms. The thought that Anunnaki decreed destiny's machinations. When you pace the remains of a complex built to turn vows and offering Shinto outcomes, Leg Ash lies in the flatlands, like a book lift open. Here the first legal reforms were carved by a ruler who wanted to curb abuses and defend the weak. Texts from this city have the bite of minute staken at a tense meeting. They speak of fishing rights in canals, of rations, and of officials who had learned to take too much. The gods of a high council met it here because someone had toehold the line when the strong leaned hard on the rest. Kish was a northern sentinel. The king list gives it the honor of rule after the flood. Its tales still keep the earth, color of long years of Sunday. Armies passed up and down, past these fields, on their way to quarrels that went only from 2 centuries. A city that watches a frontier learns to love but documents. It also learns which gods to call when you must insist that a promise ender when a throne falls. Shorup gives a different sort of chill. This is the city that later storytellers named as the home of the flood hero. Excavations exposed a band of river clay that suggests a catastrophic inundation in the early 3rd millennium. Not the end of the world, but the end of a generation's plans. Read the flood tale after you handle that earth, and it becomes plausible in a new way. A council that decides to reset the world sounds like a poet's answer to a citrusing to rebuild. Across the Tigris stands Asher, a city that would give its name to an empire. Its god, also called Asher, took up roles once filled by older southern powers. Palaces rose along the river with courtyards, where kings displayed their lives of hunts and battles in long, cool corridors. Their scribes kept omen lists and rituals, because even a staticate wins often wants a sense that victories and defeats are more than lack. Here the old title, Anunnaki, still appears, now as part of a wider ledger that includes the fortunes of campaigns and the seating arrangements of conquered gods. On a bend of the Euphrates lay Mari, a river hub where palaces held hundreds of rooms and archives bulged with letters. The tablets there record kings sending messages with gifts and threats, governors complaining about barley shortfalls, and priests reporting omens from sky and sheep. The Anunnaki Enethes lines as witnesses, a shared language of authority that let one city understand another's oath. A myth becomes policy when it is useful in a letter that must move men and grain. Nineveh and nearby. Nimrod take you into rooms of Osho, Banipal. His library hoarded knowledge with Oziel that still startles. It kept Thippic of Gilgamesh and the rituals that named the gods in the right order. Sothat a plea would find its target. In these shelves, the Anunnaki serve a Vedathi, fall of the cities that first named them. The kings who carved lions kept songs of older priests because Theward still worked. Then there is Babylon, a city that insisted on being the center of whatever world it belonged to. Its processional way ran between walls, faced with glazed brick in the color of deep sky. The Ishtar Gate wore dragons and bulls that announced serious business within. In the Temple Quarter, the New Year rites-bound calendar to kingship and placed Marduk at the head of a pantheon that still remembered the older family. When lists divide the Anunnaki into those of heaven and those of earth, that net arithmetic fits a city that like tallies schedules and measured glory. The story is not only in the ground, it lives in cases and drawers. The Iraq Museum in Baghdad holds riches that tell the whole arc, from prehistoric pottery to the tablets that name the high gods. The British Museum houses the flood tablet that made Aong Reader jump from his chair. The Louvre keeps kings in stone who still stare like men who intend to be obeyed. Berlin's museums hold a gate that glitters even in modern light. Each gullery is a stop on the same river. Objects that began as offerings and records and ended as ambassadors. What you notice as you connect these points is how thoroughly the ideas cling to geography. A god of sweet waters belongs at Eridubakas. The plain needs fresh water. A council that sets destinies belongs at Nepa because every city sent prayers there. Judges of the underworld fit a society that buried its dead. With lamps and spoke month rites at graves. The Anunnaki are not floating abstractions. They are titles that took shape where real people dug, counted, swore, and hoped. Methods matter in this. Map. Archaeologists trow layer by layer, each find with the care of a clerk. Objects without context can lie. A tablet found in a trash pit near a temple kitchen can teach more about than a tablet found in a dealer's case. Survey teams track canalines, visible from the air, and then walk them on foot to see which bends still hold moisture in a spring month. Specialists test bricks for salt togas, why a quarter of a city. Failed, out of such patient work comes a better sense of why the people who named the Anunnaki made the choices they did. There is also the living land. Marshes returned in the south after years of floss, and with them returned the look, for world that knew reed boats and water buffalo in channels bright with dragonflies. Farmers still coax grain from soil that shines with salt when you walk at noon. Pilgrims and guards still stand down ziggurat steps and watch wind push dust along the horizon. A story that began 5,000 years ago can still borrow details from an afternoon's walk. When you lay the map on a table and place a finger on each city, the old narrative falls into place without. This is the family of the skyborn out of the plain. This is the consul that speaks in a temple where a king asks for a year of favor. This is the court below where judges listen to Names read in a ritual voice. The Anunnaki are the spine that holds the map together. Follow that spine and you can travel from a first shrine on a sandspit to a library where a school boilened to copy a floodline. Stand back from the tablets and ruined sand, you see a simple pattern. The Anunnaki were the grammar of a civilization that needed order in a land of restless water. Cities named patrons, set calendars, swore oaths, and trusted that a high court would hear. When empires rose, the council was reorganized. When empires fell, the names survived in libraries that outlived their walls. Modern readers borrowed the term for new tales, but Thekor remained the same. It is a promiser that work, law, memory, and fate can be spoken clearly and kept. The story ends where it began on Thet Plain. A ziggurat step warmed by Sunday, a canal bend furred with reeds, a tablet that still carries the voices behind them are gone, yet the system they built can still be read. It tells us to count carefully, to share burdens, to respect boundaries, and to leave room for mercy. That is not a distant theology. It is a manual for living together.